So I'm going to start now, and I expect a few people will be arriving as I do the introduction. Welcome again. This is the 5th of 8 talks. Thank you all for registering, and on behalf of the Cambridge University Bahá'í Society, I'd like to welcome you. Your microphones and your cameras are off and will be for the duration for this evening, but there is the chat, which will be at various points Ishmael will use to ask questions. My name is Catherine. I'm a member of the Cambridge Baha'i community, and in collaboration with the Cambridge University Bahá'í Society, these 8 talks or events have been organised to commemorate the centenary of the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá, which is on the 27th of November, tomorrow, which was in 1921. Maybe you are intrigued by who Abdu'l-Bahá is, or maybe it was the topic for tonight that interests you. So why are we commemorating the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá? After the passing of his father, Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, Abdu'l-Bahá devoted his ministry to furthering his father's faith and to promoting the ideals of peace and unity. As well as being a prisoner for over 40 years for his teachings, he was also knighted by the British for the humanitarian work during the First World War. And I feel that this is just simplifying his life, as he had such an impact at the time and continues to for those who either follow the Baha'i faith or have come across his writings and his life work. We are fortunate to have the original writings of Abdu'l-Bahá, and we have first-hand experiences written by people who met him at very different times in his life. And we've had some of those teachings shared with us by the speakers who have studied, and tonight is no exception. But tonight we gain a greater understanding of Abdu'l-Bahá through a different medium, the art of storytelling. At the end, there will be opportunity to maybe answer some questions. So like I said, please use the chat. And to let you know, for those who haven't been before, this is being recorded and it will be shared on a YouTube channel, which the link will be shared as well. I would now like to welcome our storyteller, Ishmael Velasco. Ishmael is the founder of Adora Foundation, a social innovation organization working across the world to generate inspirational vision, creative connection, and transformational action on a large scale using research, the arts, and social mobilization as our tools. Ishmael is also a professional storyteller and has performed for over 25 years, specializing in the use of arts for social action and community development. He's performed to tens of thousands of people over that period in over 20 countries, from major theatrical venues to remote indigenous villages. Tonight, the life and nearly death of Riley has been performed in 15 countries, from anywhere from theatre in Scotland to an Inuit's living room in Greenland. We are so grateful Ishmael has adapted it for us tonight. I will now hand over to Ishmael. Thank you.
Thank you. What a joy to be here. It's amazing. There's a screen, it's all virtual, and yet I feel like I am in Cambridge with very dear and inspiring people, many of whom I've met and others who I know are such without meeting, because like seeks like. So I am sure if you are here, there is something about your outlook that that makes you create this space and this time amidst so much Zoom fatigue to explore themes of the heart and of service and of the spirit. So it really is a privilege to be here and to share this story. And it is also, I suppose, particularly meaningful at a time of relative social isolation and intermittent lockdowns. It is a time where I suppose we become more aware than ever of the significance of social connection and interaction, and of both sort of mobility and freedom, as it were, but also of the ability to communicate even past those limitations and how meaningful they are. So in spite of those physical limitations, here we are together, and it is a privilege to be here. And along those lines, and pertinent to the story that I'm going to tell you, I want to set the scene by asking your thoughts and your experiences about what you have been in this lockdown, and what is the longest that you have had to isolate and stay at home. And how did that feel like? It might have been like pure isolation. You have not left your home at all. I remember there was a time when you couldn't even exercise, particularly, except, you know, maybe a walk. And maybe it's been relative lockdown, as it were. You maybe the doors open, but you still felt sort of you had to stay. So I just wanted to ask you guys sort of to share in the chat, while you've been in lockdown, what is the longest that you've had to isolate and stay at home? And how did that feel to you? I'd love it if anyone has sort of the generosity to just share a little bit. For myself, I don't know how long, because I'm bad with times, but it has actually felt overall, even though it's been interrupted, it's felt like over a year. And my child was 4 months when he was born. Well, he wasn't 4 months when he was born. He was 4 months when lockdown started after he was born, miraculously 4 months old. And the lack of contact, the lack of human contact, the lack of physical support networks, the kind of that concentration at home, it had some consolations. It was wonderful to be able to have that connection, but it was also sort of challenging. And I know that I have kind of craved that physical encounter and that ability to move about and encounter people. Thank you, Nikki. Enjoyed lockdown greatly. I cannot recall how long I was locked down as little change. What changed was the outside world and sharing what was happening with everyone else. And I've heard many people relate to that, actually, that lockdown gave them a space to kind of, for those who had been like in the rat race, to kind of pause and land, as it were, and partly distress. And for others who had been already quite homebound, to actually have access to a lot more virtual contact with other people and communications. And I suppose chat doesn't lend itself very well for sharing sort of this kind of experience and feeling. So I think it's fair to assume that for some of us, lockdown was enjoyable, enriching in many ways, and for others, it was sort of compounded by tragedy and the inability to be at crucial moments with loved ones, for example, or isolation. And there's been sort of a big spectrum. But the reason I kind of pose the question is because I'd like to invite you to a mental exercise. I'd like you to imagine what it would have been if lockdown had involved just staying at home for the last 2 years and not leaving at all. I think that's kind of more accessible because it's been a bit like that. So it would probably feel, would be my guess, like an intense version of what we've experienced now. So if we've enjoyed it, we probably would enjoy it either a little more or a little less. If we struggle, we haven't struggled a bit more or a bit less. But now I'd like you to imagine that you spent not 1 year, not 2 years, but 5 years in your home. And in those 5 years, you were not allowed to travel. You were not allowed to leave. That I suspect, even for the most homely amongst us, might begin to feel a little challenging. If you think about everything you've done in these past 5 years, think of where you were 5 years ago, where you've traveled, who you visited, what some of the highlights and experiences have been for you of those 5 years. And now replace them with your home. Now, that may be still ambiguous for you. But now imagine those same 5 years in your home without internet and without a phone. Now think back of those 5 years. Think of who you've communicated with, virtually or physically. What occasions you've experienced, physically or virtually. The loved ones you've had contact who do not live with you. How have your relationships evolved in those 5 years? Outside your jobs, your careers, your families. And replace them with just 5 years inside your home. How would you feel by the 5th year? Maybe you've refurbished a little bit the house, moved around the furniture. You haven't ordered anything because there is no internet and there's no phone. So whatever you had 5 years ago is what you have today. And your conversations are with whoever is at home, perhaps some passing neighbor. Now, picture those same 5 years, not so much in your home, but in 1, 2 bedrooms of your home. That's it. You cannot go anywhere for 5 years. Now imagine again those 5 years. Now I'm going to ask you to stretch your mind and heart and picture the last 10 years of your life. Who were you 10 years ago? Where were you? And think of all the things, again, that you have lived in those 10 years. The highs, the lows, the milestones, the memories, and replace them all with your home. So 10 years are quite formative. And 10 years alone at home, how would you change? How would your personality shift? Who were you 10 years ago? Who are you today? Who were you 10 years ago? Who would you be today if all 10 years were spent at home in genuine isolation? Now you may think I'm exaggerating, but make it 25 years. Make it 30 years. What has happened in your life the last 30 years? take every one of those experiences out of your memory and identity and connections and relationships and replace them with your home. And now we're here. What would 40 years have been like? Were you born? Were you a child? A young person? Now you can think how you have grown, evolved, developed, manifested in 40 years. And replace it with your home, with those 2 rooms inside your home. You have now surely lost all sense of what living without walls might feel like. Maybe those images exist as myths, as legends, as memories drawn from memories 40 years ago, or memories told to you. But really, your whole universe for 40 years has just been inside those walls. All your thoughts, your tears, your joys have happened there, your education. Who are you if the last 40 years you spent there? The story I'm about to tell you is of someone who spent 40 years pretty much like that. And very similar, I guess, to what being 40 years in your own home would be like. Like you, he'd have his own bed. Like you, he'd have the decorations on his wall. I imagine after 40 years in just those rooms, how would you know, not just the decorations, but every crack in every corner? How you would draw insight, entertainment, contemplation, or despair from the shape of a brick, a spider on the floor. How those paintings or photos that adorn your walls, the texture of your blankets and your bed, the lamp at night, it was the same for him, with the only difference that his own bed was a rug. And like many of us who are fortunate, he shared that bed with somebody and was not alone at night. But unlike most of us, the somebody he shared that bed was a company of fleas that would climb from the bottom of the rug until he felt them after 4 hours or so, and he would then turn the rug around and sleep again. We all learn to sleep when we share a bed with someone, and that was the accommodation with his companions. And sure enough, there was a framed picture on his wall, like probably you have some in the walls you spent in this story the last 40 years of your life. But unlike the frames in your wall, his frames had metal bars inside it. And the painting and wallpaper was made of solid rock. And his stay was not just the 40 years you spent in those 2 or 3 rooms of your home. Just like you got the chance in these 40 years every so often to talk to a passing neighbor or somebody walking outside your window, maybe. So did he. The difference being that the people that he spoke to hated him for no reason at all, and were determined to systematically make his life unbearable. And we all lose things in 40 years living anywhere. What he lost was family, was friends, was dear ones he himself tried to cure and failed. Now replace the last 40 years of your life. Replace all your friendships, all your travels, all your trips, all your studies, all the meetings, all the jobs, all the walks in nature, all the interactions. Replace them, not just with those walls of your bedroom, but with penury and cold and hunger and disease and a constant messaging that you are worthless, that you are worse than worthless, contaminated, to be shunned, that there is merit in punishing you. 40 years each day, that is your reality. Who are you at the end of that? How do you feel about yourself? How do you feel about life? What do you expect from life? What is the story that you tell yourself that life is for or about? After 40 years in isolation, except for a barrage of hate. And then imagine that the moment comes when you're allowed to leave your home. Imagine your feelings in those rooms as you look at that door that you have looked at every day for 40 years until you had forgotten it was anything more than decoration. And know that when you turn the handle, you will actually go through. And a little bit beyond, another door awaits you to the great outdoors. Think of what is outside of your front door. The things you don't notice when you get out every day. Maybe a bush, maybe a lamppost, maybe the stone floors, the pavement. Every day you get in, you get out. But this day, it's 40 years. And you are opening that door to a new universe. And that lamppost is a miracle, not just a post. That pavement is pure wonder and perhaps disorientation. 40 years. You've not seen anything. How has the world around you changed? What are the rules? How do you get from one place to another? "40 years ago, there was no internet. There were no mobile phones. Not really. The world was different, like time traveling. And now you're out. How do you feel about the strangers that walk by when all your interactions have been the message that you're worthless and worthy of contempt, disdain, and maybe death, if that's not too good for you? Do you trust? Is your heart open? Are you full of beans? Are you jumping, or are you daunted or confused or afraid? And now, let me take you to another part of the world where at the very same time, our prisoner was opening the gate. Another man was walking in the Thames. Now, this story that I'm telling you of this prisoner and this man takes place just under 100 years ago. This man, unlike the prisoner who is in the worst and direst prison of the Ottoman Empire, in what was then Ottoman Palestine, the man who's walking is in fact in London. And his life could not be more different in this story of extremes. Because he was a man. He was white, and he came from a wealthy upper class family at the heart of the British Empire, upon which the sun did not set. Now, at that time, when Queen Victoria ruled the waves, to be born under such circumstances was to have a guarantee that the universe was yours. You were the child of empire. You were the fruit of civilization. And you were born to command. If you've seen Downton Abbey, what prospects are yours as you arrive into that world with liveried servants? His father was a church rector who received 10% of all the income of all the parish without lifting a finger. He went to public school, one of only 7 in the empire, which gave you a straight gate into Oxford and any career profession that you chose. You wanted to be an explorer, you could be an explorer. You wanted to be a scientist, you could be a scientist. You wanted to be a soldier, you could be a soldier, an engineer, a man of letters. Or if you wanted to do nothing, you were not a bum, you were a man of leisure. Not only did you have the choice of any career or venture in any part of the empire, which meant in any corner of the world, even your love life was set, because you were what in those 19th century novels of Jane Austen was known as a good party. You could provide. So much of the 19th century literature of women who did not have the right to vote, who were proscribed in their opportunities for education and becoming, so much of it is the drama of their need to find a man who will provide not just for them, but for their family and assure them a position in society. He was the man all women fought for, or the ones who created the great dilemma between love and responsibility. His ability to provide was the opener of all the doors. So there's a saying in English, which is to have the life of Riley. And I don't know the name of this man, although I know his story as true, because it comes from his own words. But I do know that this little boy, when he was born, had ahead of him the life of Riley. So if you've spent those 40 years, not like the prisoner, or even, I am willing to guess, like most or all of you with me today, if you spend those 40 years like Riley did, what would be your outlook? Servants supported you in everything. Choices and privileges were yours by default. You could choose the arts or command or creativity, the society of intellectuals or of artists, or to be a hermit or an anthropologist or even a rebel. But 40 years of endless, guaranteed possibility and success. How does that affect your sense of self? When you walk the street and see strangers, how do you relate to them? Your choices are not whether to open that handle. Your choices are whether to go to Covent Garden or to Bombay. Well, let us go back to the prisoner. I don't know what your conclusions were of how you'd feel if you were in that position. What plans you would make, if any, after 40 years of such atrocious agony. And what kind of person or fragment of a person you might feel like. Well, when this prisoner opened the gates for the first time in 4 decades and walked into the world, he did not walk out a fragment. He did not walk out a victim. He walked out a victor. He walked out triumphant. He walked out erect and strong and purposeful. Because the day he opened those 2 gates was not the day that marked his liberation. That prisoner achieved his liberation, discovered and disclosed the true meaning of freedom decades earlier, in that very cell, in those very walls, against those chains and storms of prejudice. Because when you are presented with hatred and contempt, you have 2 choices: to accept them as yours or to transcend them. and he transcended them. Because are not the walls that enclose us all much firmer than stone and much more subtle? Every time that you've been hurt by someone, does that not precondition your response? Every time you've failed at something, every time you've lost what's precious, does that not limit your ability to love again, to trust again, to dream again, to believe again? Are not those chains of memory and wounds and hurt the things that actually hold us ensconced within the walls of our own inner constraints? And how hard it is to free oneself of those. How hard it is to forgive the unforgivable. Not because it's fair or just, not because the perpetrators deserve such forgiveness or don't, but to forgive because you deserve the freedom from the legacy of pain. How hard it is to start each day anew without preconditioning your dreams and aspirations by your attainments and your failures of before. But this prisoner saw in the hatred of his jailers chains much heavier than any that ever held him. And he resolved to be free of all of them. And so where there was hatred, he found love. Where there was oppression, he found independence. When there was humiliation, he found dignity. When he experienced blame, he discovered acceptance. When prejudice and otherness attempted to define him, he found universality and oneness. And so the prison was the horizon of his flight. That was the place he left behind all that we carry. And when he walked through those doors, he did not seek repose. He sought service, because his was a tree laden with fruit. His soul was a forest in the desert. And he had a gift to give. And so he set out to travel from the benighted extremes to the center of empire and civilization. After 40 years in prison, the prisoner journeyed to London. And in London, his life was the direct inversion of his history. He was welcomed by the great and the good. He was put in beds of down and attended by liveried servants. But if you spend those 40 years considering a brick to lay your head on an extra luxury, how do you see those luxuries? And if you freed yourself from the burden of labels and names and positions. What distinctions do you make between the liveried servants and the aristocratic lady that offered to host you? They were all but fellow humans. They were all his jailer and his friends. They were all his family. They were all humanity, not just in general, but in particular, each one a mine rich in gems that he could see, where others saw just uniforms or trappings of nobility. And when the prisoner arrives at Lady Blomfield's hands, at the very same time, Riley is walking by the Thames. He's having what at that time those of his class would call a constitutional, except the purpose of his walk is not exercise, but death. He is walking toward the river to drown himself. How does someone who has everything end up there? Now, maybe you have some ideas. But Riley did not just go from his place of privilege to the deadly Thames, because the last many years he had in fact lived on the streets, on the embankment. His clothes were not the ones you pictured, but rags and stench. He sometimes slept in rubbish bins and feasted with the cats. He was kicked and despised like rough sleepers are today. And if you think this is the story of Riley, think again. Because more people die of suicide today than of all wars and violence together. 1 in 10 people will think about it. I am certain that amongst us here today, many of us have thought of it before. And homelessness is not something that happens to a category of people, but to any one of us. We are all a few crises away from a cascade of despair. Riley is not just Riley. Riley is our family, our friend, our colleague, or the person on the street that is smiling as they pass, while inside they bleed. And so Riley walked and found against a window, as he headed to his last days. I don't know if you're a reader. Riley clearly was, because even in that desperate state, he could not, like I cannot, see printed word and not read. And as he walked past a newspaper shop, he saw from one newspaper an extraordinary face. Something in that face stopped him on his tracks. He went into the shop and said, "Please let me see that paper." He picked it up and simply stared. There was something in that face that made him say to himself, if the gaze of this man is real, then I shall live. Beneath the face was an address in Cadogan Gardens. And instantly he set upon the journey to discover an answer to his quest. Was that gaze real? And as he walked back, he was 35 miles away. He was weakened by malnutrition, by illness and cold, by poor footwear, and it took him 3 days. And in those 3 days, he did not just walk a physical path, but he retrod his entire life. For Cadogan Gardens belonged to the class from whence he fell. Every step was a failure remembered. Every mile was a heartbreak relieved. Every step and path and moment, every breath was yet another failure. For how far do you have to fail to lose all the social network that could care for you, all the support, all the privilege, all the guarantees, and end up on the streets and now almost dead? And so he retraced his steps back to his origin until at last he arrived at a new gate. And there in Cadogan Gardens, he knocked at the door and instantly knew he had made his most fatal mistake. Because if you have loved and lost all hope, if you have reached such a limit of despair that you are on your way to death, can you imagine what falling lower can feel? What a greater disappointment can achieve inside your already shattered being? And for him to dare to hope again was to dig a dark and fiery pit for himself. But it was too late. The door opened, and before him stood a maid, horrified. Because if you've watched Downton Abbey, a tramp does not attend the front gate. "Is a prisoner here?" he asked. And from this rag that was his being, his accent was Eton clipped. The maid hesitated, but the aristocratic lady heard, "Come in, come in." And he stood back and looked at himself. And he knew he could not step and sully the house with his stench. Besides, he said, "I am not wearing a collar." He knew the etiquette. But she said, "This is the home of Abdu'l-Bahá, and you are welcome by himself." And so Riley, with profound trepidation, stepped in. He told his story. And we know that all this happened because that very day, that Lady Blomfield wrote it down in her diary, which has survived from hand to hand and reached us even today. Will he see me? And in that question, his whole life hung by a thread, to which she answered, yes. And Abdu'l-Bahá descended, for that was the prisoner's name. And when he saw the tramp in front of him, as he was described by someone else, they recognized each other. For who in that liveried setting could begin to understand the 40 years of Abdu'l-Bahá's prison, jail, better than the homeless man before him. And who in that room but Abdu'l-Bahá could have seen behind the broken clothes, the man. They hugged, and Abdu'l-Bahá simply said, be happy. Fear not humiliation, because you can always start again. And something in that gaze proved real, because the man departed and left. And before doing so said, I am ready to live. I will work the fields until I've saved enough to buy a plot of land. And then I will cultivate violets that I can sell. And in that work will be my freedom. And in this memory, my love, my peace, my rest. I don't know what the moral of this story is. But what I do know is that Riley is all around us. And we all have the power of a gaze. If we but see each other, then one hug, one word, one act of kindness can mean the difference between life and death. Thank you.
Just trying to come back from that. I was completely enraptured. Wow, thank you, Ishmael, for transporting us and sharing the true story in your own words, and really evoking such great reflections, not just of the story itself, but into our own lives. So yeah, I'm just trying to get my head around now, because I was back there in 1912 with you. Please, any questions or comments or reflections? People saying thank you for the story, and I'll just give everyone. I mean, it would be interesting. My question is, I know a little bit of the answer of, I know you've traveled with this performance, but I know the performance was used very specifically in communities. And now that I've heard the story, I understand why. Can you share anything? Would you like to share anything about your experiences with this story?
Well, I think what happened is that when I started telling this story, people would often come to me at the end and disclose and said, that really helped me, that I've been struggling. And this gives me the strength to believe again. Or I lost someone in that way. Or, you know, Jen, I felt lost. And I can see that there is always hope no matter what. And these kind of reactions happened very consistently. And I realized that instead of it being an accident where I kind of perform and then there's kind of applause or appreciation or silence and then this happens, I realized that actually it was so consistent that perhaps it could be done actually on purpose. And so I began to experiment, and I began to bring this story to very different settings. From, as I say, you know, sometimes it began in theaters, but it ended up in therapeutic communities, or in Greenland, which had the highest rates of suicide in the world, or in just places where people were struggling, or in schools, or, you know, across age groups. And what it created was the space for conversations. And those conversations generated hope and generated connection. And that also allowed processes to be born, because at the end of it, we'd have, instead of ending, it would be the beginning of a conversation. And we'd have an amazing conversation, everyone there. And then at the end, we'd say, well, would it be useful to have this more? Would it be useful for this to be out there in the world? Should we act together? And then everyone would come together and initiate sort of activities. So it was using the arts as a way to kind of achieve a shift in attitude and belief and group cohesion, and from there having the sort of the ability to move in that sense together.
Thank you. And I think just a comment that Grant has shared, I found the idea of forgiveness not for others' sake, but for one's own freedom, a very useful idea.
Thank you. It's something that I've had occasion to contemplate myself, and it is amazing how sort of resentment, hurt, even when it's absolutely justified. Like, forgiveness does not mean saying it's okay, it was fine. It's almost saying it's enough. It's saying I will not be defined by that. And it's very hard not to be defined by a wound you carry with you. And I think in some ways, it is fair to say you can only forgive the unforgivable, because if it's resolvable, then it's not forgiveness. You've sorted it out. It's been compensated. You forgive what cannot be paid back. And if somebody, you lend somebody £10,000 and they blew it, they're completely poor, someone you love is going to die unless you get £10,000. That person will never pay you those £10,000. They don't exist. So as long as you are chasing those £10,000, you are captive of that, even though you know that it'll never be repaid. And with forgiveness, there are things that can never be repaid, that can never be made right. But I think the ability to forgive for oneself, to say, I let it go, is not that that debt wasn't owed, is that I will not give it power over myself in that sense. And that, I think, is how I've come to relate to the calls in Abdu'l-Bahá's example and story that call for a very radical forgiveness. And I think the only way I can relate to it is in that way, that it is about one's own becoming and freedom rather than sort of someone else.
Thank you again, Ishmael. And really, I think it just also demonstrates the power of storytelling and how it can convey messages that we wouldn't necessarily receive in other mediums. And so I really enjoy storytelling to listen to it. And it's I hope there are other opportunities where maybe there are other stories in the future you could share with us as well. Maybe we'll have other events, because I do think they're very valuable. And again, more thank yous coming. Oh, one question from Ramin: how to become a storyteller?
The real answer, and this is going to sound trite and stupid, is by telling stories. We are, if you think about it, we are all storytellers. And it's interesting that you can measure your connection to someone by the stories you tell. How's the weather? Will connect you with someone, it's a mini story. But there are stories that you only tell your closest friends. And then there are stories you don't even tell them, maybe just your life partner. And if there are stories you don't even tell them, those define you in some way. So stories are part of who we are. And then to develop storytelling as a craft, I suppose, in that way, as a vehicle for expression, I can tell you my own journey, which was to jump in at the deep end. There are storytelling groups, there are storytelling cafes, there are community occasions, there are children's classes. There are so many places where all you have to say is, I will tell a story then. That's all it takes. And as long as you do that repeatedly, you'll find your own voice, and you'll get better and better. There are resources online out there, not that I've ever particularly explored them, but there are tips, and it's worth sometimes going on trainings. But the real answer is just tell stories and tell them to people, and don't focus too much on performing them. Just tell them. And if the story touches you and is strong for you and it's vital for you, you'll come to tell it well. And once you've had that happen, you'll be able to repeat it, and eventually you'll connect it. And everyone has their own approach and their own way. So I would say, don't wait for permission, don't seek a certification, go and storytell, and then you are a storyteller.
And sorry, I think I missed one comment. I'm always amazed at the mind's ability to go beyond all imprisonments. Thank you for a beautiful story. And that was from Jill, if I'm hopefully not mispronouncing.
Thank you, Jill. I was actually reflecting just before telling the story for myself, because as I was saying earlier, for me, the stories have to be present and urgent in some way for myself. And the question I asked myself is, what did it take for Riley to believe again, right? All his experience had led him to one point. He had to make such a leap to think of himself and of his possibilities in a way that allowed him a leap of self. And my question to myself was, what would be my equivalent? From this starting point, what are the taken for granted assumptions that I have about myself and my life that rule out my equivalent leap into my true self? And so in that sense, maybe the mind's ability to identify our imprisonments is as valuable as the mind's ability to go beyond them. And maybe the invitation of this tale is for all of us to be where Riley was and meet Abdu'l-Bahá in this story and in this centenary as a way to take a leap into proportionally an equivalent new self.
And I think this is the foundation of communities, and it is one is to reflect on one's own capacity and restrictions and release ourselves so we can serve others, but also to look at others to see how we can serve them as well. So, and I think the story is a wonderful example of the power of reaching out to individuals. We have no idea what their story is. So and I think on this note, I think, thank you again, Ishmael. This was a real change from other talks, but just as informative in its own way. And I hope we carry our own thoughts and understandings and the story itself. And if we want to watch the story again or share with anybody else, it has been recorded. In the last slide, there will be there's a website for the Baha'i Society, and all the videos are being shared on the YouTube channel of the Baha'i Society. So please feel free to share them with friends. There are other talks, 3 other talks coming. There's next week is Wendy Moman, the role of Abdu'l-Bahá in the advancement of women. We have Robert Stockman, Abdu'l-Bahá's journey in America, and the last talk, Rob Weinberg, Abdu'l-Bahá and the modernists, looking at art again. So thank you again. And if you have any further questions or comments, there's an email address that will be sent in a follow-up email, which will also contain all the information. So once again, thank you to everybody who have sat and listened, and thank you again to Ishmael, and wishing you all a good night.
Thank you.